Daniel 3:16 and 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from our hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up."
I want to talk to you today about the word devotion, especially as it applies to the story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. That's one of those Sunday school stories from probably a long time ago. Maybe you haven't looked at it recently. Well, devotion implies a deep love. It implies a solid commitment. It is connected to dedication and loyalty. And while it doesn't mean perfection, it does mean a strong enthusiasm and admiration for someone or something. It's a fervent religious or spiritual feeling. When we have devotion for God, it means that we are sincere in our desire to know and please and live out God's will for us. And so when I'm talking about the book of Daniel, and as I do that, I realize there's a recurring theme in Daniel. And Daniel is trying to portray the same truth through different illustrations or life experiences over and over. And the reason is he's reinforcing that God's real, that God's interested, and that God has the power to help those who will stand up with courage for him and for living the way that God wants us to. So we already saw that Daniel was willing to live differently in the king's palace when he wanted to not eat the foods that were sacrificed to idols and that kind of thing. And with great tact and diplomacy and yet resolve, he was able to show that he could be just as strong and mighty as anyone else. And remember, God worked on his behalf, and the result was that Daniel and his three Jewish friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were considered better, more excellent, even stronger than his competitors. And then last week, we saw Daniel's friends and how they were, how execution looked definite because of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and how Daniel found out that he could depend on God to help him with that. And as a result, he and his friends were promoted again. So each time God came through. Well, this is the third time in the same book where something is going to happen like that. So we're gonna take a look at this and just see how Daniel deals, or how this time we don't have Daniel in the story. We've got the three friends, and it's so. I'm wondering, where was Daniel? Well, he wasn't hiding, I'm sure. He was probably simply on assignment someplace, but he doesn't explain to us where he was. But the whole idea of the book of Daniel is that if we stand up for God, God is going to be there for us as we do that. So here's the story. King Nebuchadnezzar, this tyrant, he has just seen how Daniel interpreted his dream, and he gave Daniel and Daniel's God, the Most High God, credit. But that dream was that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold and his empire was like the top and the best. Well, it seems as if that went to Nebuchadnezzar's head. And so even though he turned to God and he looked to him and said, wow, let me lift up this Most High God, nevertheless, it seems as if it didn't penetrate into his soul and spirit so that he was devoted to Daniel's God. And so here, in the story that we've got that Dennis just read about, we've got King Nebuchadnezzar having erected this 90-foot statue, 9 feet wide, where from the plane you could see it for miles and miles as you approached it. And it's gold and it's glistening and it's huge, and everybody is supposed to come who's anybody. And so they had to come from afar for the dedication of this idol. It's a little unclear to me whether this is to represent one of his gods, because they believed in many, many different gods in many, many different territories, or many, many different things, or whether this really was a representation of him. It's a little unclear, but the idea is that the king, the emperor, says, I want all my leaders in every province, in every place, I want us to gather at this time, at this place. And he had the big orchestra, and he had the pageantry, and he had the liturgy and everything to dedicate this golden idol. Kind of reminds me of the golden calf in the Old Testament too. And everybody on cue was to bow down and to worship. Well, that makes me think, what is worship? What is the essence of worship? In order for Nebuchadnezzar to get everybody to worship this non-personal, golden image, he had to say, if you don't worship this, then over here to the left is this blazing fire. And if you don't worship, then you will be thrown into that fire. Now let me ask you this. There were thousands of people there. All of them were told to bow down when the symphony stops, or when they get to a certain point or something. And 99.9% bowed down on cue. Was that worship? Or wasn't that worship? Especially when, if you don't do this, you're going to die. Well, on cue, thousands of people bowed down. And there were 3 that obviously did not. They were strong, and they were tall, and they were resolute. They were devoted. Let me say, those 3 who refused to worship were worshiping. It involved sacrifice, it involved loyalty, it involved heart, and they were perhaps among the only ones who were worshiping. But they weren't worshiping that non-personal image of gold. They were worshiping the reality of a God that can't be seen, but that is so real that they would stake their life upon it. Now, to be honest, the king wasn't looking for them, and he didn't notice. But I want to talk about now, not worship, but a second thing I want to talk about is jealousy. Do you remember that over and over again, as these men stand tall and do their best and do their studies, that they were considered 10 times better than the other people who were in that leadership? Do you remember that when Nebuchadnezzar was asking for the interpretation of the dream, and Daniel called his 3 friends together and said, let's pray that God will help us out and save our lives and give us the information that we need, that when that happened again, those 4, Daniel and these 3 others, were looked at by the king in a favorable way, and they were considered to be a step above everyone else who didn't take a stand. So, there were those who were there, who were bowing down, that had their eyes open, waiting and looking to see what they saw as their competitor. What would they do? And when they saw, aha! They were true to their God. They were devoted to their God, which means they were not doing what the emperor asked them to do. Oh, how terrible! Because of their great principle of living, they had to go tell the emperor because they cared so much. And so they reminded the emperor, and they said, those 3 over there, look at them. Oh, thank you so much for being such a great tattler. And so Nebuchadnezzar brings them before them. Now remember, these are his shining examples. These are his great, wonderful, devoted leaders. But now Nebuchadnezzar is furious. He's angry. He's really, really upset. And he says, I'm going to give you one chance. This is it. This is your one chance. And the music is going to get queued up, and they're going to play again. And in front of all these thousands of people, you do what I tell you to. And by the way, you go stoke the fire just in case. They didn't need to think about it. They didn't have this horrible, hard, oh, what do we do? What do we do? They had already decided a long time ago who they were going to be devoted to. And by the way, because they were devoted to God, they were able to give Nebuchadnezzar their very, very, very best. But this time, Nebuchadnezzar was asking them to choose between his edicts and God's directives. And as a result, at this moment, they knew that they were going to choose God over king. And so, they refused to bow down. And what is so classic and so beautiful, what Dennis read, is they explained to the king, we mean no disrespect to you whatsoever, king. It's just that in this case, at this time, you're asking us to do something that makes God less than you. And God is more than you. And we answer to God first, and then we answer to you respectfully, dear king. And so, I want you to know, Nebuchadnezzar, God is able to save us. God is able to deliver us, to rescue us. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to, and he may not. I can't tell you the future, but I can tell you this. If he doesn't, he doesn't. And we're okay with that. Because they were devoted to a God who had sovereignty over both life and death. And how wonderful wonderful that is. Matthew Henry's commentary says that God could deliver them in death or God could deliver them from death. And do you know what? When these three were bound because they might fight back, which they weren't going to, the king had control over a certain part of their life. And so they were going to be thrown into the fire without fighting. But as they were thrown into the fire, the king couldn't help but notice. And there must have been some great big window in that furnace. And the king was interested to see what was going to happen to these three shining examples of devotion. And their God had already come through several times. And he looked and he counted Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, but they're not flailing. They're not burning up. And he saw a fourth. And somehow that fourth, walking around free among the others, looked like he was from God, or the Son of God, or an angel of God, or something other than man. And seeing that they were not destroyed, he somehow called them forth, and I don't know if he turned the furnace off or what, and they come out. And I know it takes faith to believe this. It is unnatural. It is impossible. And yet it is real. They came out. They didn't smell like smoke. They didn't have any degree burns on them. And they came out and they were praising the God who is stronger than the flames. Nebuchadnezzar's tone is different. Now he calls them servants of the Most High God who has delivered you from my fury. And no singed hair, no smell of smoke, their clothes were not burned, the fire had no effect on them, and Nebuchadnezzar again is humbled. And I'm talking about recurring themes. The arrogant king is humbled yet again, and the humble servants of God are exalted yet again. These men, again, were awarded for their determination to put God above even the king. And then, since all this happened publicly, they were vindicated publicly as well. True worship is where we prefer God's favor over man's, and we are willing to suffer, if needed, to keep our devotion to God number one. Now, we struggle to worship God, sometimes even on Sundays. But for these Jewish captives who have trusted God, worship is an everyday, every hour of the day, a commitment to serve and not waver in the public place or in the privacy of their own heart. And we're going to be taking part in communion in a little bit. And when we do that, I want you to think of how devoted Jesus has been to us. He didn't go to a fiery furnace, but he went to a cross upon which he died for our good and our well-being.